Welcome back to Munro Live, everybody. Today we have Kevin Hardy and Jordan Arocha. We're going to take a look underneath the Hyundai IONIQ 5. Now, we did review the Kia Niro and the Hyundai Kona. And those were pretty archaic architectures. I remember they had a K-frame subframe. And we're going to take a look at this and see what's changed. So come on over here, Zach. The first thing we notice is it has a full perimeter cradle. Now what that means is the cradle goes all the way around, up to the front and over. And Jordan or Kevin, you want to talk to some of the intricacies you see here?
Yeah, so from I guess starting at the very leading edge, right, you'll see that this member right here is actually bolted on, not part of the cradle here. And it's substantial. We measured it at like 4.3 millimeters, which in the world of steel is very, very thick. So what we think is happening here is because of how far this cradle is reaching outboard away from the center line of the vehicle, they're using the cradle structure in addition to the rail and shotgun structure above it to engage in small overlap. And what this member is doing, this 4.3 millimeter cross member, is as you start to load up this corner, it kind of pushes diagonally on the vehicle. This member right here, this 4.3 millimeter member, keeps the rails from closing in on one another. So it helps push the vehicle away from the barrier.
And if you remember on the last vehicle, since they didn't have a perimeter cradle, there's no integration. So as the cradle comes up, it splays outward. This is probably somewhere around like 2 millimeter or so, another 4 millimeter reinforcement. And then there's a stanchion that runs all the way up that's integrated with the engine or the motor bay rail here, and then kind of will integrate in the rest of the body structure. When we looked at the last Kias, we had a sneaking suspicion that they're probably at the edge of getting away with not having a perimeter cradle. When you look through some of the crash results for small overlap, you'd start to see some cabin intrusion and things of that nature. While they did perform well, they scored good, you could see when you start going to the details that they were probably literally on the bleeding edge of having a very defensive strategy, and now you're starting to see some more offensive SORB countermeasures in their newest iteration of vehicles. Like in general, when we talk to a lot of vehicle suppliers now about some materials, with the big thing with electrification is we're seeing a lot more mass coming back into vehicles to counteract the battery weight for crash.
Yeah, and we've seen the lower control arm shift from steel to aluminum, back to steel, back to aluminum. We've seen serviceable ball joints. Here's an instance where it's a rather thick stamping with an additional stamping welded underneath. Oftentimes we've seen clamshell versions in steel. Tesla has 2 forged members, but it's really important to be able to predict and control what the tire does in a small overlap impact scenario. So we see this large steel cradle heavily integrated in the car in the front. Being able to predict what this will do as it engages the hinge pillar is really important. And having these be aluminum, sometimes it's hard to predict whether the tire will fly outside the vehicle or stay in the impact scenario. So this is something we see actually pretty common in many of the Japanese manufacturers, is stamped steel or clamshell steel lower control arms.
Yeah, and something that, as Cory was alluding to, one of the things they look at is wheel kinematics during SORB events. The other thing is NVH, right? Noise, vibration, and harshness. How does the suspension system and all of those loads translate into the cabin? As you get through development cycles in a vehicle program, sometimes you find out late on in the program after you've already made either component and or supplier selections, and you find that you've got a mode or a noise that you can't get rid of. So what you'll see, what my hand's on right here, you'll see OEMs start to put mass dampers on the vehicles. So they're putting additional mass that's not required otherwise for the design to keep some of those NVH, those negative things from going into the cabin. So I've very rarely seen a car that had no mass dampers, but generally we consider that a negative, right? Kind of a Band-Aid.
Yeah, in an earlier episode, Jordan and I looked inside under the hood and looked at some of the thermal components. We can see them from the underside. So here's a low voltage pump. So by low voltage, I mean 12 volts, not high voltage. And this vehicle had primarily shifted to PA12 line. So you can see a nylon 12 line here, nylon 12 line here. They put small protective sleeves where necessary if there's a rub scenario. But the Lines are much better routed than the previous Hyundai and Kia we saw, but still nowhere near the level of integration we see from Tesla products. Many people always say, Cory, you're always harping on how great Tesla is. Well, these pumps, the low voltage pumps on the all Model 3s and all Model Ys, and most likely future Model S's and X's and Cybertrucks, are integrated directly into either the super bottle or the super manifold for the octo valve. Still a separate bracket right here bolted to the EDM, the electric drive module. So this aluminum bracket is doing nothing but holding this pump. And then the lines running from this pump are going to their respective components. This right here is your electric power steering. Oftentimes we don't see this motor hanging this low. Jordan, you want to talk about some of your architecture studies? You typically see this on plane with the rack or above?
Yeah, on plane with the rack or above, and in some cases OEMs were implementing what we would call concentric or inline EPS units. So this one's belt driven, so it's off center from the center line of the rack itself. And this is always a difficult thing to package, obviously on this vehicle, right? They had to pivot it down in order to get it cleared between the EDM and the leading edge of the back cradle cross member. But you know, it's not uncommon to protect these motors because they're difficult to package around, to see either them tucked up as much as possible and or shields on the leading edge. So if you did hit a muffler or something in the road, you're protecting it and not losing steering.
Yeah. We're going to switch to talk about the cooling fan for the cooling pack or the radiator.
Yeah, so what Cory's referring to, this shroud here is the cooling fan shroud. And if you look at the blades, I'm spinning it with my finger here, they're what we would call like crenellated. So they're taking the fan blades and they're putting that sort of waffle shape in them. They do that for noise. So if you've ever been standing next to a vehicle from the 70s or 80s and the cooling fan's on or something, it sounds like there's a jet getting ready for takeoff next to you. This is to mitigate a lot of that fan noise. Additionally, molded into the cover, you see these little flaps off to the side. So these flaps are not motorized, so what we would call active grille shutters, right? They're not that, they're passive. And so what these allow the whole fan system to do as a unit is when you're static, right? You're sitting still in traffic or in a parking lot, but you need cooling, the fan will be spinning, but it's not drawing air from outside of the fan periphery, right? That fan gets maximum efficacy by pulling through that void in the center. Now, when you don't need the fan to do as much of the work and you get going, the air pressure coming in from the front of the vehicle will overcome the gravity of these flaps, thus allowing the full or a larger portion of the heat exchanger to get air pass through. So it's going to be much more effective for cooling.
And if you come out to the front of the car, this is these are the active grille shutters. You can't really see them, and they're right here. And what they do is they rotate up to allow for air to come in or out. Usually we don't see them on the A surface. Typically the active grille shutters are further back in the system. There's only a very small amount of area right there which is open all the time, or may actually also have active grille shutters behind there. So aerodynamics is critical with an EV, and because the thermal loads are so much lower, particularly if the ambient temperature is either low or in a medium scenario, you want all the air flowing around the car so that the vehicle is as slick as possible going through the air. That's why underbody shields, which we removed, have a perfectly smooth plane underneath the vehicle, and then you want as much area on the front of the car blocked off. If you watch automotive racing, NASCAR, they'll put a small piece of tape even at a high-speed track, and it gives a huge amount of downforce and allows the car to go faster. But even a small piece of tape makes a big difference at 200 miles an hour, because in the equation for aerodynamics, V is squared. So velocity is very important. So a tiny bit of tape is important, or in this case, the active grille shutters.
This is actually a pretty good view if you look straight on to the point with the cradle and the battery and its overall height of the vehicle. On the other Kia Hyundai products we looked at, there was a pretty big standoff that Cory had pointed out between the overall height of where the cradle and some of the the other
Yeah.
structural monuments were and the leading edge of the battery.
Yeah.
So this is much improved.
Yeah, and what we were worried about on the other Kia products is that the battery was lower than the Cradle. So if you do run over any road hazard, the first thing that was solid besides the plastic shield was the leading edge of the battery, and the thermal hoses, or the coolant hoses, and the high voltage line and the low voltage line were on this leading edge of the battery. They're now recessed, so a little bit more protection in this design from what we saw in the previous design. And Jordan, you want to talk about this lower cover, its material?
Yeah, so it looks like unsaturated polyester, glass filled, plus DD. I'm unsure what DD as a filler is, but 75% and 48% fill respectively. So they're using a pretty high concentration, likely of glass, right? Because if you look at it, you can actually sort of see the fill in the glass and the material. Maybe hard to pick up on camera. And then if you tap it, it's got a very high density feedback to it as you tap it. But this is obviously for aero, but as well as stone impingement, right? To keep the bottom surface of the battery pack, which is aluminum in this case, protected. And because they do have a standoff here, right? It's going to help from an MVH perspective as well. Yeah. Yeah, and you know, when we're looking at battery packaging, we started with the leading edge. As you go down the side, we were talking about this a moment ago before we started, that the battery pack, the spacing between the inboard side of the body structure sill and the outboard side of the battery pack is substantial, right? There's probably 30 millimeters plus of space between those two monuments. So that's generally not, we've seen it trending oppositely, meaning a lot of the competitors we've looked at, they're trying to expand that versus narrow the pack to increase the amount of batteries you can carry, therefore your range, etc. So either, you know, they found out via side pull impact simulation or what have you that they need the additional free crush space, and or they just made a conscious choice knowing that there was some key elements they wanted to route down the side here and created some space. But nonetheless, that's a larger space between the inboard side of sill and battery that we would typically see.
And on the other side, they run the brake lines to the rear.
Yeah, thank you, Kevin. So right here, they're running the coolant, and as Kevin mentioned, the other side, they're running brake lines.
So a few interesting things is they moved the low voltage connection to the battery to the rear. I remember it being in the front on the other vehicles. We typically see the low voltage connection in the front. The rear cradle is all steel, and they do utilize small pencil braces right here. So the half shafts go above this, and then they come in and put a small pencil brace below the half shafts, and then a small pencil brace cross car right here underneath the rear EDM, electric drive module. Something that we don't typically see is a forged aluminum lower link here. Most OEMs are using a stamped steel piece here. Maybe they wanted to get it up out of the air, so I don't know the reasoning behind that. And it's also not common left and right. The forging might be common because it looks symmetrical the way I look at it, but no, it's not. It's nearly common, but it does say right here and left right there. Yeah. And that may be a missed opportunity for them to have a common part left and right. But all the other cross-car links are welded clamshell stamped steel for these two, and then an open hat section here for this lower link.
Yeah, it's always super interesting to look at a suspension system when they've got mixed material strategies, because you know, something that most people don't think about when they look at it, they just think of like weight or strength or anything like that. But a lot of what they're doing is balancing bill of material, like actual piece cost for the program. They're looking at production tooling, right? Stamping dies are very expensive. Die casting tools are quite expensive, right? Whereas if you can use like a brake pen piece of steel, it may not be that expensive. So they're balancing a lot of these cost equations, and we're seeing a portion of the, you know, the reason why things are the way they are is as a result of those analyses that are going on, right? So there's a lot of development and cost evaluation that goes into these.
One thing we like to see is where the mounting provisions for the electric drive modules are integrated into the castings. This one is. So this outer cover has a completely integrated mount. Previous iterations of electric drive modules have brackets and then mounts connected to those brackets like you'd see over here. This is where you have one of your mounts connected to a bracket that's bolted to the outer edge of the electric drive module. Even the most well thought out strategies for a whole corporation, you can't accommodate every size and form factor of the vehicle, so you have to have some provision to allow for a different unit to fit in a different platform.
I'm actually kind of surprised, to your point, Jordan, about the lower control arm, that they didn't do extruded aluminum. You know, you see it a lot on Volkswagens and Audis, some Chrysler products, some Ford products like the Escape, where it's cheap. They extrude to length, maybe 1 or 2 secondary hits with stamping, and it's become more common in general for lower control arms, specifically in the rear of the vehicle.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and once again, just a little mention, right, on the back of the Cradle. Once again, they've got a pretty heavy cast iron mass damper suspended in rubber on the Cradle here. So clearly they're having some issues with the NVH, right, and they're trying to tune it. But you know, as Cory was mentioning, it's tough to accommodate every feature, every element of the vehicle. There's a lot to manage.
I'd be curious to see if the front, dampeners are present on all trim levels. Remember some of the BMWs, with certain wheel packages, dampeners are present. High runners, they're not, and things of that nature. So it's always a balancing game for cost and options.
All right, so that was a run through of the whole underbody of the vehicle. We want to thank Hyundai PR Group for providing this vehicle for us to take a look at. Between Jordan, Kevin, and myself, we've seen hundreds upon hundreds of vehicles over the past 18 years for me and about 10 years for each of you at Munro. So hopefully this walkthrough gave you a little bit of context about what you see. All these minute differences that we pick out are very intriguing to us, so we hope that we can bring that through the camera to you on this YouTube video. Sandy Munro is focusing most of his effort on the Model S Plaid teardown, which is happening right now. Those videos will be coming shortly, a couple before this and a couple after that. We were able to take this vehicle on the track, and we ran it on the same loop that the Plaid went on. That video should be coming out shortly as well. So, and last but not least, we are hiring at Munro & Associates. It's a common theme in all of our videos this year. We had over 100% growth last year at Munro & Associates, and our workforce expanded by 35%. We're probably going to have a similar growth this year. So if you want to be part of this great team and be exposed to all of this new leading technology, send us your resume at hr@leandesign.com. And that's all we have for today. Thanks.